Let's summarize. Often people will get reasons for why they should choose one another that are very technical, and I want to bring that up a little higher as for managers and executives who are not actually programmers, to be able to understand some of the things and critical issues and perspectives on these landscapes changed over the last 3 or 4 years. I think 3 years ago, if someone had asked my opinion about if they should use React or Angular, I would have said something very different than I'm going to be recommending today. So what's changed in the last 3 or 4 years? Most of the tooling and ecosystem and maturity of developers. One of the things I recommend companies to avoid is pursuing a technology stack just because it's a bright, shiny new toy right there. It has to be some real valid criteria for going into choosing a particular tech stack and to understanding the consequences thereof. And I think it's a really interesting set of pros and cons about why you would choose one versus another. Here, for example, the difficulties of using React or Angular. Let's take, for example, React. When a developer is looking at using React technology to build a web application, often they have very fast success. They can get involved very quickly with the technology without a lot of knowledge. They can go read the docs and pretty quickly get started and demonstrate some success very fast. And so often, though, that's used as a drying criteria for saying, well, let's use this from now on. Let's continue. Let's take this initial idea and release with it our product. And I think that's a mistake. So it's really the decisions being based on how simple it is to get started versus what would be the best choice long term. There is a big difference between experimenting and playing with technology and trying to deliver a real production application. And it's not just the technology itself, it's also the tooling around it. How do you build it and how do you deploy it? How would you test with it? If we check the learning curve, we can see that React is really easy to get involved with. And then it hits sort of peak where all of a sudden they're not being productive because they've hit issues like where do they get a forms library package and how do they add forms? How do they add data services? And how do they do the state management? And how do they compress the application when they want to build it? So in case of React, those decisions are often made ad hoc. It's whatever tooling the developer found. Might pull a library from one resource and another library of another resource and say, oh, I can use this. And he would figure out how to plug them together. And eventually they're going to get it to work. And they would get something to work. So developers going to hit this productivity barrier where things slow down. And then gradually they'll get more familiar with the ecosystem they're putting together, and they understand the sort of the flow or how to add of other views and other things. And then it will sort of level out, and then they'll be more productive. Doesn't mean the productivity increases, but the productivity level will sort of be maintained. So you would ask me, how does that differ from Angular? The challenge with Angular is if you don't have a foundational training with Angular, it can be very hard to get involved. So Angular has a whole bunch of conventions the way you're supposed to use Angular. It has tons of libraries. It has tons of patterns that you use to scale and build up your application. Both of React and Angular usages are view-based. In other words, the whole goal is to create views that will show in a browser. With Angular, though, the real tendency is that developers don't approach application development from the view first. They approach it from the data first. What is the data flow? And the data service and the business logic that we want to have in our application. And then they fit the views on top of that. And in React, I feel it's the other way around. In React, You are building views and you are composing hierarchies of views, but you are not so much thinking about layering your business logic and all of that in this way. With React, often the business logic can get mixed in with the views way too much, and it's not best practices. So you would ask me, what's the complexity then of having this business logic side of my components? What's the harm here? Then the biggest reason that you don't want to do that is it doesn't isolate your business logic. Hence, it's within the component, it's hard to reuse. It's very difficult to test your business logic. What I tell teams is they want to try to write the application a specific way. Imagine if I came along and I said we're ripping out all the views. Ideally, I should be able to test all of your application, all your business logic, your data flow, and the changes of your state of your data without any UI. And then you put UI on it, because what does UI allow you to do? UI does only two things. It renders the data so you could see it, and it allows you to interact with it. So the UI just allows you to interact with the business logic. And in React, it's very easy to mix those. Doesn't mean that it's possible to keep it separate. What it means is that it's a tendency to do the wrong things. And as for Angular, I've seen really bad applications too. However, in Angular is the way they approach building your applications from a set of features. And you're using libraries and layering your application in terms of UI. It's data services and business logic and state management. It makes it very easy to use those patterns. And then when new developers come on board to the team, or you have one person that transitions to another product, well, you need another person to come on board with the current one. It's very easy for them to get involved because it's a set of repeated patterns. So this is the base foundation in Angular. Also, Angular has a suite of libraries that comes with it. We can see that Angular has a whole bunch of libraries that come as part of the platform. We have internalization, routing, lazy loading, forms, HTTP RESTful service, features, and more. All of these are baked right into the platform. And the way they interact is very well defined. Therefore, once you know how these parts are made to work together, it's super easy to use. And in my opinion, the thing that I love most about Angular is the idea of dependency injection. Dependency injection essentially allows you to configure how components are going to be created. And then, when you request an instance of that component, whether it's a service or a view, you don't care how it was created. You don't care what it depends upon. You can just say, give me an instance, and you can use it. So it's like California style. Now, that doesn't seem like a big deal. In testing, though, it's a very big deal, because what you want to be able to say is give me an instance of the component, or how it's been configured behind the scenes. It doesn't matter. You have just asked for component A, and I'm going to give you a mock. Your code doesn't have to change one bit. I'm giving you a mock because now I can test it. Hence, this idea of dependency injection radically simplifies how you're testing, which then, of course, radically improves the quality of your application. Now, the React team, in contrast, also says we have dependency injection available. I wouldn't say really dependency injection, but they do have a mechanism that they really allow that. So I'm not leaning into Angular or React. I like them both, but then the question comes, how do you choose one or the other? And actually, I contend you don't have to choose one or the other. There are just some considerations for what your choice has an impact on. The really interesting thing is if we take Angular and we take React, what happens if you have a product in a company, one is done in Angular and one is done in React, and you have developers and you want them to switch teams? For Angular developers, it's pretty easy, in my opinion, to go and work on a React project. They have to know 3 to 5 key things, but after that it's pretty easy for them to work on the React project. It's significantly harder for a non-Angular developer, a React developer, to come and work on an Angular project because of the lack of Angular's foundational knowledge and patterns. I often look at the return on investment of investing into technology stack. What we want is a product that has good customer success and is stable, and you minimize regressions between releases. And so that means you have to be able to test it well, and you also want an ecosystem that you can then hand off to other developers if you need to. And both can do that. One just requires more of a deliberate focus on patterns, versus maybe Angular requires not so much of deliberate, because it more forces you to follow these patterns.